offshore wind is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Independent and nonpartisan, our sole purpose is to find and disseminate the verifiable facts on the benefits and the risks of renewable energy from offshore wind. We're thinking globally and acting locally, doing our part to responsibly address the climate crisis that threatens our seaside community, our fisheries, the world's oceans, and ultimately life on Earth. You can see most of our steering committee members on your screen: Judith Hope, Jessica James, Kate Rogers, Jerry Mulligan, Michael Hansen, Tina Plessett, and David Posnet. All of us are volunteers. Wind with Wind has no staff, and it benefits enormously from the pro bono assistance of Arnold and Porter and the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. In the face of accelerating climate change, with its myriad adverse effects on our community and our planet, we at Wind with Wind celebrate the near certainty that the South Fork Wind Farm will be built and that it will land its cable at the least disruptive and most cost-effective location, Beach Lane in Wainscott. It'll be the first commercial-scale offshore wind farm in the entire country. Wind with Wind, therefore, has pivoted to focus on the effects of the offshore wind during construction and operation on marine life, and to learn about the best practices to avoid or mitigate any adverse effects. Researching the topic, we turned to Catherine Bowes, Program Director at the National Wildlife Foundation, the highly respected lead national organization dedicated to the protection of wildlife. She's a fount of scientific information and has been an endlessly helpful ally. We are honored that she and Sophie Hartfield Lewis, Head of Permitting, Environmental and Marine Affairs at Ørsted, will join us today. We asked each of these highly knowledgeable women to introduce their organizations and to point out the complex ways that the wind farm might affect endangered species, specifically but not limited to the Atlantic right whale. Then we will have lots of time for questions and discussion. But before we proceed, a little bit of housekeeping. First, as you've heard, but if you just joined, this seminar is being recorded. We plan to post it on Wind with Wind's website. All the participants will be muted so that we can best concentrate on the speakers. So if your Zoom is not set to view the speaker, you may want to adjust it so you can see the speakers, their slides, and their gorgeous photographs. Then, most important, please send any questions you may have to it in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have a lot of questions submitted in advance, so we may not get to all of those submitted during the meeting, but don't worry. If your question is one that we don't get to, we will send all of those questions to the speakers, and Catherine and Sophie have very kindly agreed that they will respond to any questions that come in. So today we're going to focus on how Ørsted can mitigate or avoid any adverse effects and how our community can monitor the effects and the mitigation measures. We've been very impressed so far with the seriousness with which Ørsted has approached these issues. We're particularly delighted that Ørsted is working in partnership with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Still, much about these mitigation measures and avoidance measures are in early stages so far. No one has committed to them exactly or even decided. One reason is that these mitigation techniques are quite new and the technology is evolving rapidly. Some of them are still in development. Ongoing monitoring and stakeholder engagement will be essential. We at Win with Win will be all in for the best possible methods and for assiduous monitoring with regular public reporting. We will all learn as we go. Sophie now leads Ørsted's North America Permitting, Environment, and Marine Affairs Department. It provides strategic and project-specific advice on mitigating environmental risks, stakeholder engagement, and maritime advice. So now let's go to our participant questions. We've received quite a lot in advance. We hope you will post more. But first, Catherine, could you go first with some introductory remarks, please? You're muted, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Alice. And I'll just go ahead and share my screen here. I do have a few slides to accompany my opening remarks as well, yes? Let me just get those, get that loaded for you. A minute, it's better if I try to not do it while talking. How's that? All right. Can everyone see my slides? Ever seen the picture? Okay, great.
You know what? I have forgotten to properly introduce Catherine. I only introduced Sophie. Is the National Wildlife Federation's Offshore Wind Energy Program Director, a program they launched in 2010, and it plays a national leadership role on the issue working to build powerful coalitions all along the coast in support of responsibly developed offshore wind. She is a member of more official committees and working groups than we have time to mention here. Practically every state on the East Coast has appointed her to some official body or another. She has been at the National Wildlife Foundation for 17 years. Before that, she worked for 6 years at the Conservation Law Foundation, working to build support for advocacy to protect the region's natural resources. She holds a master's in environmental policy from Bard College. Catherine, I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you to Win with Win for holding this, this seminar and for inviting National Wildlife Federation to participate. And thanks to all of you for joining. There's such an important role for public and stakeholder engagement in this conversation. So it's really wonderful to have so many of you take the time to hear about this and join us for the conversation. So as Alice mentioned, I am with National Wildlife Federation, and I direct our offshore wind energy program, which we started just about 10 years ago now. And this opening slide I have here really captures why National Wildlife Federation is one of the oldest and largest conservation organizations in the country. If you're not familiar with us, we were founded back in the 30s by actually hunters and fishermen, wildlife enthusiasts across the country that banded together to create a voice in Washington to advance policies and actions that would protect wildlife. And over the years, our work has evolved around our mission of protecting wildlife. And today, our work is focused on three big areas. One is confronting climate change. We know that climate change is the single greatest threat facing wildlife here in New York, across the country, and around the globe. We also, have a robust set of programs around wildlife habitat protection and environmental education. If you may be familiar with Ranger Rick magazine and some of the other publications that my organization puts out, really working to mobilize or inspire that next generation of conservationists. So that's the context with which we come to offshore wind. And again, back to this slide, we know that climate change is such an important issue to solve. And we also know that offshore wind energy holds tremendous potential for contributing, massive amounts of clean electricity to the grid right where we need it the most. Also, it's really significant infrastructure building the scale of offshore wind that we know that we need, and ensuring that it's done in a way that is protective of our marine and coastal wildlife is so important to National Wildlife Federation. So that's really the spirit with which we launched our offshore wind program back at the end of 2010. And we've been working, as Alice mentioned, with partners along the coast. And I would say that one of the first meetings I had when starting this program, again, a decade ago, was joining my colleagues, Adrian at Citizens Campaign and Gordian at Renewable Energy Long Island. And we marched into Long Island Power Authority and said, we need wind. What are you doing? You know, this is an incredible opportunity for Long Island. And that was so many years ago, and so many RFPs and processes that unfolded since that resulted in the contract being awarded to then Deepwater Wind, you know, for New York's first offshore wind project. So it's great to see Maureen and Linda from those organizations here on the call with us today. And you all are just so lucky to have such an incredible set of advocates on Long Island, really pushing for this. So I'm proud to work in solidarity with all of you. So it's been over the last 10 years, you know, we've been working really hard, both to push for state policies to advance offshore wind, as I mentioned, and also to push on for the leases and permits from the federal government that are needed to make it happen. And so much progress has been made over the last few years. I want to just share this slide quickly so you get a sense of how this one project fits into the overall state of affairs of where we are right now on the US East Coast. The map here on the left shows all of the the areas that have been leased by the federal government, and the projects, where the projects are that have been contracted by states. The little pie chart or donut, I guess we call it, to the right there shows all the contracts that have been awarded by states to date. And it's about 9,000 megawatts. That's a lot of offshore wind power that's been committed. And it's a really exciting time, especially with the new federal administration coming in very quickly to move offshore wind forward. It's really an exciting time for offshore wind, and of course, an important critical moment to make sure we get it right. But I just want to show you this in context, so you know that the South Fork Wind Farm here is really one of many, certainly will be one of the first for the country. But with that comes the importance of setting a strong precedent, given how many projects really are in the pipeline, many of which are to be developed by Sophie's company, but several others as well. And so it's really an important, even more important that we get it right here at the South Fork Wind Farm, so that we're starting on real solid footing as this industry stands up here in the US. As I mentioned, National Wildlife Federation is strong supporters of responsible offshore wind development. And so I just want to say a little bit to set the stage here for our conversation about what that means to us, and then provide a little bit of specifics about where things stand with right whales. So really, there's a bunch of words here on the slide. I'll give you the overview is really just environmentally responsible offshore wind development means that every step of the way is guided by, you know, scientific integrity and comprehensive input from stakeholders and experts, and that we're ensure that research is happening along the way so that we have that great science to feed into the process. So just really strong rooting in both scientific integrity and robust engagement. And then with that strong science and engagement, every step of the development process we should make sure that we're taking great care to avoid, minimize, and mitigate any impacts from offshore wind. And each stage of project development really offers a range of different opportunities to do that, and a range of different potential impacts to wildlife based on the stage of the process. So siting, first and foremost, where is the project located? So you want to at first make sure that you're avoiding sensitive, critical habitat areas where offshore wind development just should not occur. You know, example of that is, you know, real close to shore. As you get, you know, in state waters of the mainland, you know, within a few miles, you see really just a heightened level of activity of birds and other wildlife that, you know, that would be impacted. So we've been strong proponents for moving these projects far offshore, outside of that sensitive coastal zone where those impacts can be mitigated. So that's one example of the location opportunities for ensuring wildlife protection. The second is during the construction phase. The activities, adjusting the timing and even the method of the construction activities can significantly reduce the impact of a project overall on wildlife. And, you know, an example of that we can talk about a bit with right whales is sort of adjusting the construction schedule to avoid times of year that we know right whales are most likely to be in the area, as an example. And then the operations and maintenance of the wind farm. Once the project is up and running, there are additional needs and opportunities for protecting wildlife along the way. couple examples could be lighting strategies to minimize the degree to which the project impacts birds. Another operational opportunity to minimize impacts is vessel speed restrictions, making sure that the boats that are servicing the wind farm are maintaining safe speeds to minimize potential impacts to whales, as an example. And then decommissioning. It's hard to imagine at this point, but at some point we'll be taking these wind farms down, perhaps. And so making sure that even at that stage, there's long-term planning to ensure environmental protection when those activities occur. So that's sort of the, again, basic snapshot. What does environmentally responsible offshore wind development mean to us? But then perhaps most importantly, who is responsible for it? And I know we're going to talk a lot with Sophie here today, and Ørsted maybe is in a little bit of a hot seat here, but I want to be clear that this really is a shared responsibility of ensuring that these projects are built responsibly. The federal government has a huge role to play in advancing both the leasing and the permitting actions, and doing the environmental reviews and issuing the approvals for those activities. So there's a huge role that they play in ensuring that these are responsible projects. State governments have a huge role to play. They pick the ones that are going to get built. As I mentioned, these are competitive, extremely competitive processes for projects to win contracts. And states have a real opportunity through that process to ensure protections are in place. States also have a permitting role as these cables, as you all know very well, as these cables come to shore and are brought on, the power is brought on shore. There is state and local permitting that is important there for ensuring protections. Of course, the industry has a role to play in advancing responsibly developed projects for sure. And then of course, NGOs and stakeholders like yourselves have a big role to play in speaking up and ensuring that all the other three understand our priorities and are able to see the support for responsible development from our communities. So then specifically, I'll talk a little bit about right whales. I apologize, this is another tough slide, but I did want to just provide some context on what we're dealing with here with right whales. The right whale, North Atlantic right whale, is a critically endangered species that migrates up and down the US East Coast, and the population is currently in decline. I just wanted to share this slide from my friends at NRDC, who I work really closely with on this work, that just shows you sort of where we're at with the population. According to the most recent data from the federal government, we've got about 360 individuals in this species. And for those who follow right whales closely know that most of them, if not all of them, are known to scientists and have names, and we know their parents and to what degree they've had children. And it's really a closely monitored, loved and treasured species that is well understood to be on the brink. And as this slide shows, again, we've lost, many whales a year since 2011, and there's currently estimated less than 100 reproductive capable females, which is just incredibly dire straits for a species. And so with that, National Wildlife Federation has been working, since day one, since we started our program, we started looking closely into the right whale issue and to see how we could make sure that adequate protections would be in place to protect these whales from the two major stressors that we see offshore wind development posing to them. Underwater noise is the first one, both the survey work that the developers do in advance of a project, and of course the noise from the turbine foundation installation. So that pile driving work creates underwater noise that can create a risk to whales. And then ship strikes. Vessel collisions are a major source of mortality for whales and right whales particularly. And so making sure that as these projects are developed, we have a good handle on the underwater noise and vessel speeds to protect them. And we've been working really closely with our colleagues at NRDC, as I mentioned, also Conservation Law Foundation, industry leaders like Ørsted and others to develop and advance protective measures to ensure that projects can be developed with the strong support of the marine and particular right whale community. And some of those strategies are here, and we'll dig more into it. This is my last slide, I promise. But basically, again, seasonal and temporal, meaning at night, restrictions on surveys and pile driving. Key to protecting whales is making sure, is minimizing the degree to which they are in the area when these activities occur. So making sure that you can monitor for them is a key part of that. Keeping the speeds down, keeping the noise down, and again, comprehensive monitoring, making sure that in real time, we are, as the projects are constructed, there are not whales in an area of harm. So that's basically how the recommendations that we have been making and working with our partners on together. And I'll stop there. I know there's a lot more to talk about, but just to say that we are grateful to be on the panel and looking forward to the discussion and your questions. And I'll stop sharing.
Catherine, that was a wonderful introduction. You all can see now what a fount of valuable information and a helpful ally Catherine is. I feel as if we've already had a seminar before we move on to Sophie. But now we'd love to hear about Ørsted's approach to these issues. We're honored to have Sophie Hartfield Lewis. She brings 15 years of experience in energy projects, always with a view to environmental and sustainability. She led the team that won permission to build the world's largest offshore wind farm, the Hornsea project. And that was the first UK project to be given permission to build in a harbor fortress special area of conservation. Quite an accomplishment. She now leads Ørsted's North America Permitting, Environment and Marine Affairs Department, which provides strategic and project-specific advice on mitigating environmental risks, stakeholder engagement, and maritime advice. On to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Alice, and I will try as hard as possible to step up to the high standard that Catherine has set there. So I will. I'll just share my screen with you all. Yeah, I hope. Okay, let's try that again. Okay. Super. Okay, so thank you so much to Win with Wind for inviting me to come and speak today. It's a real honour to speak to you all and hopefully try and touch on some of the things that we're doing in Ørsted and in the South Fork project in terms of the mitigation and the strategies that we're using for the deployment of responsible offshore wind. So I'll start a little bit with a potted history of Ørsted. The really interesting thing about working for Ørsted is that we weren't always a renewable energy company. A few years ago, we were a oil and gas company, and we made a big transition a few years ago to move solely into renewable energy, and we actually sold off the vast majority of all of our oil and gas assets. We still have a couple of power stations, but we're actually converting them from coal to biomass as well. So we're really keen to push forward and become a much more sustainable and biodiverse focused company with that shift into renewable energy. So we're very proud of our track record and our experience. We're currently the global leader in offshore wind with 7.6 gigawatts of installed capacity. We have about 2.3 gigawatts that's currently in construction right now, and that totals operationally 1,500 turbines with 28 wind farms in operation around the world. We've done a few firsts as well. So we have the world's first offshore wind farm, which was Vindbu back in 1991, and that's 5 turbines. Oh no, actually I think it was around 8 turbines, but it was 5 megawatts as a total wind farm. So you can see where we're going from back in the early days of offshore wind in 1991. We are very proud owners of America's first offshore wind farm, Block Island. And as Alice mentioned there as well, we also currently own the world's largest offshore wind farm. And the next largest offshore wind farm, which is Hornsea 2, is actually being constructed as we speak right now. So very exciting times, I think, for the offshore wind industry globally, as well as in North America. In North America, Catherine's slide showed all of that scope of all of the projects up and down the East Coast. But I did want to delve into some of the projects that we're currently working on or progressing forward. So we have Block Island Wind Farm, which is in operations. that doesn't mean that our work stops. So we still carry out monitoring and ongoing mitigation throughout the whole lifetime of the wind farm, which is 25 years plus, depending on the turbines. And so we are still working on that wind farm as we speak, in terms of reporting some of the bird surveys that we're carrying out for the operations. In terms of the other 5 projects that we currently have in the portfolio, so those are awarded projects, so they have power offtakes from different states. And basically those can be summarized nicely into our Revolution project, South Fork, Sunrise, Ocean Wind and Skipjack. But I did want to do a little bit of a deeper dive today into South Fork, because I know that's particularly close to your hearts, and our furthest and most advanced project in the project development pipeline with the federal regulators. So before we go into any more detail, I thought it might be useful to just set the scene in terms of why offshore wind is so critical to where we are in the North America geography. As we know, there's huge electricity demand up and down the coast. And as you can see from this graphic here, there's also a very high wind speed off the coast, which pairs beautifully with the large buildable continental shelf. So you can just see this paler blue shelf here. That does make it much more attractive for having fixed bottom foundations. And so it combines beautifully to have really great resource and really great areas for offshore wind. So I know there is a lot of text on this slide, but what I was trying to kind of pull all into one place is all of the work that we're doing specifically on South Fork on the environmental protection measures. So I know we wanted to talk a lot today about marine mammals, but I also thought it's particularly useful to talk about some of the other habitats and species that we're monitoring across every aspect of the wind farm. So, and to Catherine's point around some of the environmental protection measures that we've tried to implement, we have widely spaced wind turbines, so there are very big gaps between the wind turbines, and that's to allow a clear and easy transit for any vessels operating within the wind farm. We have pushed those turbines out to 18 miles offshore. And that helps us in terms of the amount of birds that are in that area. It does really start to reduce down once we get further offshore. We've put minimal lighting on those structures to avoid any birds or bats becoming attracted to the structures. We have best management practices for any prevention and control of any spills from the turbines once they're in operation. And we are applying a horizontal directional drill to avoid and minimize any impacts to the beach and the near shore. And basically what that does is kind of go underneath the beach effectively. So there'll be a very small impact on the surface of the beach. We're also burying the onshore cable, and what that means is that we can do that and not have to kind of trim back so much vegetation for overhead lines or anything along those lines, and that does again help to reduce some of that risk once the wind farm is in operation. Specifically to the post-construction monitoring that we're looking at, so we are planning on having tracking and receiving stations provided by Motus, to look at birds and their movements within the wind farm. And we're also funding several studies to look at the roseate tern movements in and around the wind farm too. We have ship-based avian point count behavioural surveys. So that's looking at how the birds are actually interacting with and around the turbines. I can go into a little bit more detail about some of the behaviour we have seen around some of our operational wind farms. So we have started to see that some of the birds do start to fish from the turbines, which is great to see, I think, really. We also have acoustic monitoring for the nighttime where we can't actually see those birds and bats flying around. So we're still tracking them throughout that 24-hour period. And we have a lot of reporting requirements around if we see any dead or injured birds or bats around the wind farm, then we report those, and then we can go into a little bit more detail with all that data that we collect as to whether there's any mitigations that we can offer in that context. And that really underpins what we're doing in terms of the adaptive monitoring. We're ready to adapt to those to the data that we collect and what we're seeing in real life, as it were, as opposed to just looking at the models. I obviously will spend a little bit more time on marine mammals, because I know that that's something that's very close to everyone's hearts. So some of the things that we have done, and a lot of these are getting feedback from our stakeholders, such as Catherine and her colleagues. And that is, we won't be doing any pile driving in the winter periods. We have protected species observers on a lot of our vessels, and so they will have high-powered binoculars, which I have heard called big eyes. So they're basically super zooped up binoculars. We have thermal cameras, night vision devices, underwater hydrophones, so we can hear what the marine mammals are doing if they're vocalizing. We have web-based detection and reporting software. If you're interested in any of the links to those pages, I have them and can provide them afterwards. We are also looking at what type of noise mitigation systems that we can deploy when we're actually piling on the project. And so I've popped in a picture here at the top. It's quite small, but that's an actual piling vessel with a bubble curtain around it. That's the bubbles that you can see there. And so that what a bubble curtain does is effectively it helps to reduce some of the noise. So outside of that bubble curtain, the noise will be reduced to any species that are in that area. We also have some really quite strict requirements around not starting piling and when we can and can't pile, actually as we're out on site. So we visually and acoustically clear areas so that we are being as precautionary as possible around when there are marine mammals in those areas, as well as trying to reduce the noise. We really try hard to not start that piling when there are marine mammals in the area. We are proud that we've committed to having a 10-knot speed limit on a lot of the vessels that will be in operation. So we're trying to work that through now in terms of what that actually means, and look at if there's any other types of option for tracking the marine mammals more effectively, so that when they aren't in the area, and we definitely know they aren't in the area, we can go a little bit faster. But clear other things when we're transiting are maintaining distance from marine mammals and sea turtles, and again, use of the right whale monitoring apps, which I can share with you, and you can track those species live as well if you would like to. So I've just taken snapshots of some of the species here, but there are many more different types of measures and monitoring that we're doing for other species. So for benthic and finfish, we are minimizing our impacts to the hard bottom habitat by trying to microsite some of our turbines. We're looking to bury cables. We use dynamic positioning vessels. Now, what that effectively means is we're trying as hard as possible not to place any further feet from any vessels on the seafloor that we need to. And those dynamic positioning vessels don't need to place feet effectively on the seabed. They can position themselves and hold them themselves in those areas. We work collaboratively with many different science entities and the commercial and recreational fishing industries to try and reduce some of those impacts if we're seeing some significant risks there. And again, spill and discharge prevention, which also feeds into some of the benthic and the finfish mitigations as well. In terms of monitoring, we have ongoing monitoring surveys right now. So we're working with the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation and URI to carry out various surveys as we speak, so that we really know what that baseline environment is going to be. And that involves things like trap surveys, fish pot surveys, and also looking at acoustic telemetry as well. I do have other slides, which I will share after this, because I did want to kind of go into a little bit more detail about some of the things we're doing on marine mammals specifically, but I don't want to take up all of the time. So I will finish there, and the slides will be available after if anyone would like to see them.
That was terrific, Catherine. Even before the questions, we've had a really wonderful introduction to a complex array of impacts and mitigation measures from both of you. Thank you both very much. We have more than a dozen questions, which were submitted in advance. This first one, I'd like to hear comments from both Sophie and Catherine on. Maybe Sophie can start. It's a bit of a long question. This one says, I've heard people complain that not enough research has been conducted and analyzed to understand the impacts that the wind farms have in our Atlantic region. It's a two-part question. The first is, what sort of research has been completed, is underway, or is planned for the projects specifically off the coast of Long Island? And who does that research? Is it government agencies, independent educational institutions, Ørsted itself? And then the second part of that question is, given that wind farms has been operating for many decades in other parts of the globe, there are, what, I think 5,400 of them operating off the coasts of Europe. What might we learn from research existing from offshore wind abroad? And what can that inform us about American offshore wind farms?
So what I'll do is I'll take the first part and then answer some elements of that, and then Catherine, if you jump in if I miss anything, and then perhaps we'll go back to the European question after. So I think in terms of, we tried to lay out some of the surveys that we're carrying out right now on the project, but I'll take a little bit of a step back and say that when BOEM defines these areas for the wind farms, they do a lot of survey and outreach and build upon the existing survey and efforts that are carried out by NOAA as well on that eastern seaboard. So there is a lot of other survey that goes on. We do come along as a project entity, and we do look for surveys specifically for South Fork. So we just go into a little bit more detail and kind of zoom into that lease area a bit more. So we do seabed geological mapping in the cable corridor. We've done a seabed habitat assessment. And we do that before we go into the wind farm, and also after we've completed for example, we do it before we install the cable, and then we do it again afterwards. So we're actually really looking at the before and after, and then we can really assess what that impact truly is. In terms of the fishery studies, so we're doing some small mesh trawl surveys just off the beach at Wainscott. We're doing the acoustic tagging and the telemetry there as well. But we also work with a lot of other agencies and with BOEM, and from a federal perspective. So BOEM is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So we work with them to carry out some more regional surveys. So very recently is the New England Aquarium aerial surveys, which have been carried out from funding from BOEM and some of the state agencies as well. And we also work a lot together with some regional entities that combine all of those different people and different interests. So that there can be much more study carried out together. So, for example, the Regional Wildlife Science Entity or the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. So, but I'll Catherine, please jump in and.
Before we go on to Catherine on this, many of us are familiar with this kind of alphabet soup of NOAA and BOEM and the others, but I did want everybody to know that in Europe, to cite an offshore wind farm, it's one government decision in Brussels is made. In the United States, 27 different organizations have to make a decision on it. Here are East Hampton trustees and East Hampton board have made that decision. Sophie, could you tell us what BOEM and NOAA are and a little bit about what their role is? Just briefly, it's very complicated, I know.
So in the context of offshore wind, so BOEM is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and they are the lead agency that brings all of those 27 agencies that you mentioned together to assess all of those impacts. They draw from the specialists in NOAA and get their views and perspectives on what impacts NOAA kind of thinks may occur from the wind farm. And then they bring that all together and then make the decision on the projects. So they have a 2-year plus process to bring all that information together after the developer has submitted the initial information to those federal agencies.
Thanks so much. Now on to Dr. Catherine.
Sure. I think Sophie gave a good overview. I would just maybe say a little bit more about the study that she mentioned that the New England Aquarium has done over the lease area where this project will be built. It's an effort that actually started back in 2011 before the leases had even been bought by, well, it was Deepwater Wind then who bought this lease. But even before that lease sale occurred, the lease area had been identified, and National Wildlife Federation and our partners were eager to begin having accessibility to data on the areas, recognizing that in order to really inform how we would think about what should be done there, how it should be done, you really need a robust set of data over years, particularly for marine mammals and especially for right whales, to be able to base those decisions on. So we fortunately were able to convince BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, as well as Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to proactively fund right whale or marine mammal and sea turtle and bird surveys of the areas in advance, so that we would have public data to work with well before the developers came in and did some of the more site-specific surveys. So it's a really good example of there's a range of data that we can all draw on to kind of inform our thoughts on projects and mitigation strategies needed.
Thanks to both of you. Now, for contrast, we're going to have a very short question. This one is, what species of marine life are native to the construction area? That question is for Sophie.
Thank you. So there are very many, and I do want to point everyone to the South Fork construction and operation plan. There is a whole chapter dedicated to this. So, but what I will do is give a couple of examples of the species that we've found so far. So there are many different types of fish, invertebrates and marine mammals. So I mean, along the cable route, we've seen a lot of scallops and striped bass. In the wind farm area, we've tended to see more cod and squid, which is where they tend to spawn a little bit further out, and multiple large whale and dolphin species, a few seal species, and 4 sea turtle species. So we have seen a lot, but there is a lot more information on that in the construction and operation plan if anyone would like to see that.
Catherine, at the National Wildlife Foundation, which of these marine animals are you most concerned about and why?
Thank you. We're concerned about all of them. We share, we certainly value and treasure all the wildlife in the ocean. But of course, the relative risk is something to think about given the state of the species and the likelihood of offshore wind development having an impact. Just because there's species there doesn't mean that there will be an impact. And so needing to really think about those where there is a potential impact, and that brings us right to the right whale conversation. I mean, it would be hard to see how right whales wouldn't be at the top of anyone's list of species to be most concerned about with offshore wind development, just given the overlap of the offshore wind development areas with the migratory routes and the areas that are so important for this area in particular is one that we know right whales use quite a bit throughout the year, and we're learning more with in many ways, a lot of the data that's being collected in anticipation of offshore wind development. We're learning a lot more about just how important that area is for right whales, how often they use it, and what they're doing there. The fact that it is such an important foraging area and socialization area would be, I think, the term they use, but an area critical for reproduction. And so we want to make sure, again, that that really important life functions are not adversely impacted from offshore wind development in the area. So right whales are really right at the top of the list.
Great. Sophie and Catherine, that sounds really important and also very complex. And it might just be left to the experts, but we're a pretty active community, and a lot of people here want to be involved. They want to assure that it's being done right. So, Sophie, how do you envision ordinary people, ourselves, being able to follow the reports on marine life, its effects, and the mitigation role in the construction areas during the construction, so that if there's anything that people are concerned about, they can speak up about it, bring your attention to it, make sure the community's attention is brought there before it's all over.
Yeah, no problem. So overall, we have to submit reports to BOEM, and a lot of those reports will happen in real time. They won't necessarily be public available until the end. But where we can share information live is we have several apps. We have our whale alert, which is not our app, but it's an app that anybody can use right now. So to track and see where the whales are. And also the idea behind sharing some of that data, and when we're reporting that, is hopefully it does reduce the risk for North Atlantic right whales in particular, for all mariners out in that area at that time. We'll also have some live updates probably from the South Fork webpage, so you can always sign up for the project emails, which will give you regular reports and that type of thing. But if any of you have read any of the monitoring reports, and I know that David spent a lot of time looking at our protected species marine mammal monitoring plan, they can be very, very technically detailed. So we do provide all of that information. They can take some time to turn around though. So most of the live reporting information will be able to be found when we're kind of tracking the whales on the whale alert apps and things along those lines.
So now our fifth question, back from the short ones that are a little easier to get your head around. We have a very long, complicated one, so I'm going to break it into a few parts. The question is all about protracted noise and its effect on the whales. This questioner asks, when a human being is subjected to protracted noise, say, think about gunfire during a war, they can lose their hearing temporarily or even permanently. Is it the same for right whales? And how do you measure hearing loss in whales? There's lots more to that, but let's Catherine first and then Sophie answer that part of this question.
Sure, thank you. And I believe I did say up front, I am not a biologist, so I want to be careful of my answers here, because I'm sure there'd be a far more scientific one. But the impacts, underwater noise is such a significant potential threat for whales generally, and right whales specifically, because of the importance of sound to them in their in their life needs, life stages, right? So both can happen. The injury, as you mentioned, so if they're very close to the noise, they could, the pile driving noise could create permanent or temporary hearing damage, and that's really significant for animals that rely on hearing to navigate, to communicate. Mothers and calves communicate, find their potential mates, and all of that. It really is essential that they have good hearing. And so it's not only the direct injury to their potential hearing, but also just with a significant amount of noise sort of dampening, it makes it difficult for them to hear, because they can't, it dampens the soundscape is the word I'm looking for. So when the noise is occurring, even if they're far enough away that it's not injuring them, if they can't hear each other, because of all of the noise that's created, then that could disrupt their migratory routes, or could separate moms and calves, and that kind of thing. So it's both. It's both injury and sort of impact on activity.
Well, I'll
say I'm not going to have to ask the rest of it, because Catherine's done a wonderful job of covering the answers to a lot of the other questions. Please do.
Yeah, I did want to add something just specific for South Fork on this one, is that we're very, very confident that we're not going to have that injurious impact on the kind of the immediate loss of hearing. So what from us, and again, I'm going to say I am not a marine mammal biologist either, but I do have the benefit of having somebody who was explaining to me earlier what the difference is in that type of noises, and that noise impact, if it's injurious, is related to a permanent threshold shift. So you'll commonly see it called PTS, and so we're very confident in the mitigation measures that we have for the project, that is not going to be an impact to the hopefully any of the marine mammals in the area, but specifically North Atlantic right whales.
I may have missed it, but I didn't hear an answer to how does one measure hearing loss in whales?
I didn't answer that, and thank you. I could get back to you on that. I'm not sure of the precise process by which the scientists do that. I think there's certainly a good amount of modeling here that is part of this to assess sort of the potential impact on hearing. But I'd have to get you a whale biologist to answer that one.
Sophie, do you know the answer to that one?
So I can tell you some of the studies that have been carried out, not specifically on whales, but on smaller harbour porpoise species. So they can do, and it's. I think this is probably why there isn't a huge amount of information about this. Is that there was one harbour porpoise that had a lot of noise assessment carried out on it, and what they did is they had a harbour porpoise that they put in a tank effectively, and then I think it was in the Netherlands, where they did a lot of experiments in relation to how the harbour porpoise acted once that noise was made. But there's a lot of scientific peer-reviewed studies on it with the smaller species. But again, I will also firmly agree with Catherine on this one, and I think that's most definitely a question for a far more educated person than myself.
Great, thank you both. Now, a follow-up question related to your mitigation technique for this, and that's this bubble curtain. So when someone's in the shower, it's hard for them to hear anyone outside the shower. Does the bubble curtain work that way around pile driving? And could that noise both protect the right whale and other marine animals on the outside? Can it also warn them and push them away from the area so they don't go so near the source of the more acute noise? How does that compare with a shower?
So the way that I've described it, so I've taken your analogy of the shower and I've taken that to another level. And the thing with the bubble curtains is they act like a sound damper. So basically what that is, if you're in a restaurant and they've got sound absorbing panels on the walls or ceiling, that's how it works. So it kind of reduces that sound down. So it dampens the noise and it stops it from traveling so far as well. So not only are we making the noise effectively smaller, but it's not traveling as far once you have the bubble curtains in use. And we definitely, what we've done is based on the ground conditions that we've assessed on South Fork, and based on all the information that we've collected over the years on the piles that we've used in Europe. And we've extrapolated a lot of that data to try and work out exactly what types of noise mitigation we need to use to reduce that noise down.
Great. And there's lots and lots of questions about this. It's so interesting. So people also want to know how much reduction in percentages is there in the noise? And there are 3 different techniques currently available to mitigate this problem. You chose one, you chose the bubble. What are the other 2? And why did you choose the bubble curtain? What are the factors that were most important to Ørsted? Or was that something that NRDC and the National Wildlife Federation chose and you decided to agree with them? How important was cost in your decision? How important was downtime? How important was reliability and efficiency and the difficulty of installing or making these techniques work?
Well, I'll start, and then please do feel free to jump in, Catherine, or if any, jog me on any of the points that I've missed. So overall, what we try and do is we look at it on a case-by-case basis. So we engineer each pile individually based on what we know about the seabed, and then we can look at the types of noise mitigation based on that. So what we try and do in this stage, in this process of the project as it goes forward, is we try and keep our options as open as possible. So at the moment, a bubble curtain is in our project envelope, but there are other noise mitigation techniques. There are many different types that we can use in terms of there can be kind of like almost like I would say a pillow device between the hammer and the actual pile. So when the hammer hits the top of the pile, you get some noise mitigation that way. And then if you combine that with a bubble curtain, and then you can gently start to tap the pile in, it really starts to have those big noise reductions that we need. I think in terms of how we look at that, it really is the biggest thing that we have, I think, is the ability that it works. There are many technologies that are in very early stages and in the infancy stages of technological development. We have an in-house R&D team based back in Copenhagen who spend huge amounts of time scouring the market for all these new types of technology. And we also have an innovation hub based in Rhode Island. And so the gentleman that works in that, he is looking at technology that's pretty much ready to go to market, but we can start to potentially test it on some of our projects as we go forward. So we can actually start kind of funding and increasing that technological drive through the noise reduction and efficiency. In terms of some of the reliability is key. We must be able to make sure those systems are working and that we're able to get the noise reduction that we need. There is an impact around downtime, and one of the reasons that's really critical is for these projects, we want to be able to install in one season. Now, the reason that's important is we don't want to have to move everything and then remobilize in another season. So what we really try and do is, because we don't go into the winter period, is we try and look at how we can do this quickly, but with a reduction in that noise that's coming from that pile installation. And obviously, the other key thing that's very important to us is health and safety of the people out on those vessels and deploying and using that technology. So that is another key thing that comes into this as well. We really do like to be able to ensure that we can not be out on the water as long as we need to.
Here's still another question. Related, but looking from a quite different perspective. We're beginning to get more and more questions on the chat, so we're adding this one. And that's, what about the floating platforms? Wouldn't that mitigate, in fact, eliminate pile driving? Can the developers include changes to embrace new technologies like importing, like adding those?
So I think absolutely, and I think floating technology is most definitely something that has a strong future moving forward. I will say that in comparison to the point you made, Alice, about how many turbines globally are installed, I think there are less than 50, and I think I can probably maybe even less than 20 floating turbines actually installed and that have been operating for a few years. One of those is off the coast of Scotland, and I also think there are a couple of test turbines in Japan as well that they're actually in operation. The challenge really with the floating technology is it is very much for deep water. It isn't effective in shallower waters, and that's what we tend to see more on the outer continental shelf here in the East Coast. So for example, if you were to look at offshore wind off the west coast of the US, very much focused on floating wind, and it would be incredibly difficult to have any type of fixed bottom type of turbine off the west coast.
Just to build on that, Alice, if I may, In addition to floating, as you mentioned, there are other foundations that can be used in shallower water that don't require pile driving. So that are gravity-based foundations. So they, rather than pounded into the seafloor, they float down and sit on the seafloor. And one of New York's projects being built up off of New York City is going to be using those foundations. So gravity-based foundations. So there are other ways other than floating, as Sophie said, which is still in the early days of commercial development. There are much more advanced commercial development options for avoiding pile driving if that is the approach.
Great. Now we're going to move away from the noise question a bit. This question says, aren't fishing nets and gear a much bigger problem than pile driving?
Well, currently, for sure, we don't have offshore wind pile driving happening on the U.S. East Coast, with the exception of the Block Island project and a demo project off of Virginia that went in last summer. So currently, of course, pile driving is not threatening right whales, and right whales are in significant decline. And as you note, fishing entanglement and fishing gear is really one of the major threats along with ship strikes. So currently, yes, but I don't think that, that's an issue that needs to be addressed for sure. But it also, yeah, in terms of the relative importance, I think it actually speaks to, because the species is so impacted from entanglement and fishing gear. There was a recent New York Times article highlighting the impact of that entanglement on the species and actually documenting that it's stunting the growth of whales in particular because of that. So, it's really related to this intense conservation crisis moment that the species is in. And I think it just actually furthers the importance of making sure that the impacts of pile driving are, are minimized so that we're not, further sending the species off, off the brink here.
Okay, back to Sophie. Life is becoming more and more wireless. It would appear with GPS that a lobster pot could be reliably located without a buoy and rope. Is this true? And a related question that came in from David Posnet this morning, listening to the seminar hosted by NYSERDA. By the way, we have nearly 50 people signed up for ours in NYSERDA. Only 8 people showed up. So citizen power works. But the question that came out of that is pretty interesting. This question is, will Ørsted employ digital surveys? And if not, why not? Because during the NYSERDA seminar, we heard that the digital surveys are 10 times better, more comprehensive, more accurate than visual surveys from a boat, and 4 times better than aerial surveys from 1,360 feet away. But they have some limitations. Sophie, can you talk to us about that?
So I'll pick up on the wireless, life becoming more wireless. So for what we do for the offshore wind surveys, we use acoustic breakaway buoys for our fisheries surveys. And so essentially that's what they do. They release an acoustic pulse, and that triggers the buoy to pop up when we're done. So yes, for offshore wind, we've started to look into that now. I'm just going to. So in terms of the digital and so I'll take it. So digital aerial surveys and the boat-based surveys. So we have used a little bit of both globally, depending on where we are. And a lot of that is around what the legislation requires us to do, but also what's most appropriate and safe and effective in terms of the distance offshore and what we're trying to cover. So for example, I think if you take some of our projects, we have done some of those digital aerial surveys because they're further offshore, they're large areas to cover. It is also safer actually to do some of the aerial surveys in relation to boats in some situations. However, as you mentioned, there are limitations to that. So for example, if we see a particular marine mammal and you need to get down to see how we identify that, because that's how we when they're doing the surveys, we have to get the right clear headshot to know what species it is, and also if we can identify it in any more detail. And that can sometimes result in us having to come down and circle the marine mammal, which isn't, it's you know, we don't want to be carrying out any additional harassment that we don't need to. So overall, I think we're very in favour of the transition to digital aerial, because the other thing about the great transition in terms of the digitalisation of this is we can actually use that data and share that data, and then it's available to everybody. And I think that's a really key thing. And finally, also a little bit linked back to the safety point as well, you know, we'd love to be advancing and using uncrewed aircraft or uncrewed vessels, so that there's much more safety. And NOAA are doing a big advancement in terms of looking at some of those that transition to more digital surveys.
Okay, thank you. Now, this is a bird-loving community. I bet half the people on this show watch birds, and we all love them. So maybe we'll do something on birds in the future, but a question came in on them today. Can anything be done to minimize the deaths from birds and bats? For instance, turbine blade colors or designs? Sophie, you want to start on that and then see if Catherine has anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really interesting, the birds and we've done a lot of surveys, I think, on Block Island in terms of the bird monitoring, and we've definitely seen that there hasn't been the impact that was anticipated in terms of the birds interacting with the turbines. In terms of painting the blades the different colours, there was a study that was done, I think, over in Europe on an onshore wind farm, looking at painting blades different colours. It was for a very particular set of species, and it was for an onshore wind farm as well. I think the main risk of painting the turbine blades different colours is that does pose a risk for whenever anyone's flying near and around the wind farm. One of the reasons they're painted that off-white colour is because they're very easy then to see if you're flying over. So there are very many different reasons. The other thing as well is, you know, painting the blade impacts on the integrity of the blade. And they could erode more quickly. But I will give you a very brief anecdotal example of some of the unanticipated impacts that we had on birds in one of our West Coast wind farms from the UK. We had a problem where the gannets started to actually fish from the turbine platform. So most of the turbines have a little platform around the bottom where our technicians will get onto the turbine to carry out the servicing. And what they would do was use the railings around that platform to sit on, and they would fish off them, which was great. Unfortunately, that did then result in a lot of bird guano, and we then had to spend a huge amount of time and a huge effort to clean the bird guano constantly off the turbine, so it was safe for our technicians to get onto the turbines, because if anyone doesn't know, it gets very slippery, bird poo, when it gets wet. So what we did in the end was we actually installed some extra perches that would extend out a little bit off the turbine platform. And I think, for me, that's a great example of adaptive mitigation to something that was inevitably a positive impact on that particular bird species. So, yeah.
Catherine, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think the perching is a good example. Also, lighting strategies can help. You know, as I mentioned, primarily for bird protection, location is a big one. So making sure that these projects are located far offshore and not in areas of you know, shelf breaks or other areas where we see a lot of bird activity. But even then, the potential for migrating birds that likely are not interacting with the turbines, because they're likely migrating at much higher heights over these projects, you know, over the water. I mean, these birds that go, you know, from Long Island down to the Caribbean, you know, and all of that, the incredible migratory story. And But if lighting, they may not have come down to the turbine space, but lighting could draw them in, right? And so the opportunity to ensure that lights are certain, colors and point down, and are maybe only triggered when there's an airline in the area, that or airplane in the area, that kind of thing. So ways to just minimize the degree to which the wind farm would draw them in is another big one.
Now, here's a bit of a tougher question for both of you, I think. We'll wish we had NRDC on this panel as well for this one. The question is, what assurances, solid assurances do we have, or might we be able to obtain, that Ørsted and Eversource will use the best available technology for the protection of marine life and for migratory birds, regardless of the cost and the contributing factor of downtime? Who wants to start on that one? I think start with Catherine and then go to Sophie.
Sure. And I think one of the slides that I showed about sort of who's responsible for making sure the development is responsible kind of speaks to that. I think, fundamentally the permit approvals and the terms and conditions of those permit approvals that Ørsted and each of these developers receive from the federal government is really where the rubber meets the road, as they say, where those actual permit requirements will be. And that's a ways out, right? And so it is, it's wonderful to hear Sophie describe their plans and see them, included in what they've applied for permits for. But at the end of the day, the only actual, hard and fast assurances are going to come in those permit requirements, and both from the federal government. And then I would say the only addition to that is, state contracting processes can also apply terms and conditions to those power contracts. So the South Fork contract with LIPA was, as I mentioned, one of the first, but subsequent contracts that New York State has been engaging in have included upfront requirements for conditions for environmental protection early. So this latest round of contracts that New York State issued, as a condition of that contract, developers are not able to do their pile driving at night, as an example, which is a huge wildlife protection or marine mammal protection strategy, because it's incredibly difficult and at this point not feasible to effectively monitor to ensure that whales aren't close enough to that pile that when the pile driving starts, there wouldn't be harm. So New York State has just taken that off the table and said there's not going to be pile driving at night. And so there's an assurance that we have right now and I'm grateful that New York State has taken that. And so we want to sort of encourage states to do other things like that, where earlier in the process, we can ensure some protections will occur.
Sophie, do you have additional comments on this one?
I think just to say, yeah, with in agreement with Catherine, we've got very strict environmental laws in the US that we have to follow as we go through this 2-year permitting process. And there are several acts like the Marine Mammal Protection Act that we need to be in compliance with. And we know that our regulators will hold us liable. The other thing that's really important, I think, with Ørsted as well. And a couple of weeks ago, we were pretty proud to announce that we are starting to look at how we can not just be compliant with those restrictions, but for some of our future projects as well, and building into that pipeline that we have coming is actually looking at net positive benefits to biodiversity. So it's not just a case of looking at what we have to do, but also what we can add to the environment where we're building offshore wind farms too.
That's great. We focus laser-like on what all the possible negative impacts of wind power are. Sometimes we forget that nothing has no impact whatsoever. So we're comparing this to oil and gas rigs out there. We're comparing it to accelerating climate change. So would Catherine first and then Sophie comment a bit, kind of narrowly on this very broad question. But this question is, what impact is climate change having on the right whales? That's a much bigger impact than the wind farms, I would guess, but tell us what you think about that.
Well, climate change is impacting everything in the ocean, right? So I do think that it is certainly important to think about how how that impacts right whales, both changes in prey distribution and abundance, bringing, as waters warm and species shift around, the predators need to shift around with it. And so, we're seeing, as an example, right whales, in 2019, most recently, we're heading much farther north and into areas in Canadian waters that they hadn't typically, where they wouldn't go typically, following prey, that their food source that had moved up there. And that unfortunately led to a significant mortality event because they found themselves encountering shipping lanes and other activities that aren't currently being managed for right whale protection in the ways that, in US waters where right whales have been managed and protected. So it's sort of a climate change impact, but sort of a climate change and human related, well, climate change is human related too, right? Impact where they kind of come together. And I think the importance there is, again, it's not to say that, of course, offshore wind is a critical climate solution and we need to build it, but recognizing that climate change, fishing entanglement, and other stressors are so significantly impacting the right whale, it's all the more reason why the offshore wind development activities need to be as minimally impactful as possible. So it really isn't an either or, but it is certainly an important point to recognize that the ocean overall is really, changing.
Why we're all here, Sophie?
Yeah.
No, I think I totally agree with Catherine. I think, offshore wind, our primary aim is to reduce those emissions and to really help mitigate the impact that climate change will have, exactly as Catherine said, on all species in the ocean.
So we now have 3 more questions, again, focusing just on the right whale. So the first one is, Catherine, could you pull back the slide on that you showed at the beginning for the people who came in later, showing how many right whales were left? Because the question is, what changed between 210 and 215 that precipitated the dramatic decline in the right whales in that time period?
Okay, let me get my screen.
Well, you could just answer it, only if it's easy to get it.
No, I'm happy to do it. I got it right here.
Yeah, that the question relates to that.
This one? Okay. Oh, hold on. Okay. So and I was doing it while you were reading the question, so apologies. But the current estimate, most recent from the federal government, NOAA, National Ocean Atmospheric Authority, is 358. And I'm sorry, that was on top of the thing. So the slide here, this is a graph from a NOAA report that is actually linked in the slide. So when we circulate the slides, you'll be able to get to the report where this graph is, that is showing, while there was some increase seen in the early 2000s, since about 2010, we've been headed downhill. Were those the dates that you were asking?
Yeah, I want to know, since 2011, why the precipitous decline? What changed? Oh, am I muted?
I think I would say in terms of like what the actual deaths were from, increased ship strikes and entanglement in fishing gear, right? So those are definitely, of the recorded deaths, the cause of mortality that we've seen. So
it's maybe showing a dramatic increase in the amount and the size of ships.
I think it's this is where it would be great to get an actual right whale biologist to speak with you. I want to be clear of where my expertise is and where it is not. I've spent a lot of time working with the industry on this, but I definitely am not a right whale biologist. So my understanding is that there are fluctuations in the population. Of course, that this is a species that just has not recovered from whaling. Even with the increase here, I mean, if you zoom out, you're still talking about incredibly low numbers, right? Here, and so I think there's trends, from a few years to the next, but the reality is that climate change, entanglement in fishing gear, and ship strikes are what has driven the species to where it's at.
Okay, Sophie, maybe you have something to add to that, but I'm also going to throw you another right whale question. Are they only on the eastern seaboard of the United States, or are they found elsewhere? And if they're found elsewhere, are those elsewhere also endangered? Of course, these species are worldwide, not U.S. That's the question.
Thank you. So there are 3 different species of right whales. So there's the North Atlantic right whale, the North Pacific right whale, and the Southern right whale. All 3 of those are considered endangered under the US Endangered Species Act. But the southern population numbers are in their thousands. And they're also growing a little bit in the North Pacific, but in the North Atlantic, the numbers are in the hundreds. So we are they are in very different positions in relation to each of those species.
Here we are. This is a question: is there a solution to dealing with vertical buoy lines? And if so, why hasn't it been made a requirement for a permit? It's going to be our last question, folks.
In terms of for the offshore wind surveys, we do use those acoustic breakaway buoys. So slightly similar, but that's for the surveys that we carry out for the offshore wind farms.
Great. Thank you both, Catherine and Sophie. That was superb. It was informative. It was enlightening. And you're both engaging speakers. For all of those participating, if we didn't have time to get to your question, or if you think of another question afterwards, never fear. We'll forward your questions to our speakers. Just email them to us. Sophie and Catherine have been endlessly generous with their time, and they've agreed to answer any questions we didn't have time to get to today. Wind with Wind expects to post this seminar for your reference and for your use. So we hope that you'll all show it to your friends and colleagues, and that you'll post it on social media. You can look for it on our website. I don't know exactly how long it will take us to get it up. Maybe best to wait till next week. Maybe is Michael there? Michael could tell us what the time frame is. Michael, could you unmute yourself, please, Michael Hansen, and tell us when people should look?
It's a mystery.
Okay.
When I get the video, how about that?
Okay. So you'll be able to turn it around and post it really quickly, despite all the other things you're juggling?
That's all it takes. Yep.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Alice.
Okay, our website is windwithwind.org. David Posnet is going to send everybody a link afterwards. Now, Wind with Wind is expecting that if you all like this seminar, and with such wonderful speakers, we can't, and wonderful questions, we don't know how you could not. We're getting lots of nice comments back already. We'd like to do some more. And what we ask all of you is please let us know what topics you'd like us to focus on. Suggest speakers. There've already been some chats coming in suggesting future topics and speakers, but all of you, please let us know if you'd like to hear more from us, and if so, what. Please, everyone, go to the Wind for Wind website to learn more about the responsible transition to renewable energy, and especially to explore how you might help you. It will make a difference if you write letters to the editor, if you comment on social media, and if you testify knowledgeably at various public hearings and less formal meetings. Don't worry, once you have registered for this, you are on Wind with Wind's mailing list, and we will let you know when there are opportunities to testify or to speak at any kind of public hearings. And all kinds of perspectives and comments are welcome. And we are happy to help give you any guidance as to how to comment at a hearing or a public meeting if you'd like. So we'll see all of you at the next Wind with Wind seminar. Thank you very much for joining us. A hand for our speakers.